This video is for reading 51, which is entitled The Many Costs of Anti-Asian Discrimination. We're going to begin with just some additional sociological background slides about Asian American Pacific Islander culture and diversity. Asian Americans are a relatively small fraction of the total US population. The 2010 census, for instance, has them at 5% of the population. And although they have experienced some growth in between the 2010 and 2020 census, they are still one of the more smaller racial ethnic minority groups. That being said, this group has grown dramatically in the recent decades. A lot of this growth is due to immigration. The largest groups trace their ancestry to China, India, as well as the Philippines. But the Asian American group itself is a very broad pan-ethnic label because there are so many groups that represent different nations of origins, that have different religions, that speak different languages, that therefore have kind of different cultural traditions and values. It is really hard to speak about the Asian American Pacific Islander as some type of cohesive or unified race, although we do frequently try to do that. But really, a big takeaway here is that this is a group that's very diverse. Admittedly, one thing that a lot of this group has in common, particularly some of its more larger, more established groups, is that they have higher levels of education, lower poverty rates, relatively high incomes and occupational statuses. But it's worth noting that this isn't true of all Asian American sub-ethnicities, particularly some of the smaller groups from Southeast Asia. You'll see that they work in blue collar occupations and have higher poverty rates as well as lower educational attainment rates. And these discrepancies within the group reflect the conditions under which people from different countries come to the United States. A lot of the immigrants that come from countries like India, countries like China, countries like Japan, they're coming on work and education related visas. And these visas, of course, are provided for people who are attending college and graduate school, as well as people that are usually working in more white collar, upper middle class fields. And so, of course, that means that their socioeconomic status reflects that. But people, ethnicities, sub-ethnicities that are coming from Southeast Asia, a lot more of them are coming into the United States as refugees, which means they are fleeing their countries with very little, usually due to violence or political oppression, or economic crises. And so they're not coming in with the same amounts of educational, financial, and cultural capital. But because we tend to think about Asian Americans as, like I said, this kind of unified, cohesive group, we tend to stereotype them quite broadly. And so one way we do this is by applying that model minority stereotype across the board to all Asians. And of course, this stereotype is based upon what Americans perceive as their commitment to and their investment in higher education, and that this should be a model for other minority groups that don't have those same high levels of educational attainment and the resultant high incomes that go along with that. And that's really what this reading is about. It's about picking apart at that label. So the reading opens by describing the model minority imagery as both omnipresent and dangerous. Omnipresent in the sense that it's become very pervasive. It exists both outside of Asian American, cultures and subcultures and families in the U.S. But it also exists within their subcultures and their families, because this imagery has been internalized. And so for this reason, it can become dangerous, feeling like, you are being defined by this stereotype and that you have to live up to this stereotype. So the reading discusses, this model minority stereotype. It dates back to the 50s and 60s. And there's actually a little interesting backstory. This is partially how America, largely white Americans, of course, this was during the Cold War with Russia. And, Russia was trying to sow discord in America, as well as just kind of tarnish America's like international image. And one way they did that was by pointing out that America had a very hypocritical stance, right? They espoused these ideals and values about freedom and liberty, but during the 50s and 60s, if you're a racial minority, this is not the America that you're living in. And you know, as a response to that, you know, Americans really, they didn't have much to say if you're looking at, you know, how they treat African Americans during that time, how they were treating Native Americans at that time. So instead, what they do is they focus on Asian Americans, and it's not so much that, you know, they argue like, "Hey, we've treated the Asian Americans well," so much as they were like, "Look how successful Asian Americans are in this country. Clearly, that couldn't be the case if we were racist." And so, if you're saying that the reason why other minorities are doing poorly in this country, well, if they just looked to Asian Americans as a model, then they would be doing better. And so, this is how this idea that they were a model minority, model in the sense that they were modeling attributes and traits that made them more appealing, more desirable, safer to larger white society, and a model in the sense that they were held up as a standard that other racial ethnic minority groups like African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos should follow. And like I said, at some point, this became such a pervasive stereotype, it did become internalized by Asian American Pacific Islanders themselves, who, the reading notes, they saw this stereotype as a shield to protect their children from discrimination and mistreatment, right? The idea, if you do well enough, if you do a good job, you are going to, you know, white society will have to accept you. You won't necessarily face this discrimination that other racial minorities face, as well as the discrimination that Asian Americans themselves had faced in the past in America. Like, think about the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 1800s, and you know, the rounding up and internment of Japanese and Japanese Americans during World War II. So this reading is focused on how the respondents respond, conform, and resist that imagery. Admittedly, I don't think it's the best organized reading, and the methodology in this isn't very clearly described in this selection. But I do think there are some important points that I just want to highlight. So the reading does emphasize that the pressure on people to uphold this stereotype comes from both inside and outside of their group. But in terms of who should be held most responsible for that stereotype, the authors are very clear that it's not the Asian cultures who should be seen as mainly responsible for these pressures to excel. Because one issue with making it seem like this stereotype was created and was maintained and was promoted by Asians themselves is that when you do so, you're grouping all Asian cultures together. And we've already talked about there is a great deal of diversity and variability within the Asian Pacific Islander population in the United States. The second issue is that, you know, when you're making this cultural argument, especially, you know, it puts you in this slippery slope position if you say, oh, well, minorities can get ahead in this country if they have the right culture. Then the flip side of that coin is for the minorities who aren't getting ahead, it's because of their culture. And as the book notes, it ignores the larger structural and historical factors that relate to both how individuals of this specific group entered into the country, how they were received, how they were treated, how this led to historical legacies where people were either able to accumulate educational and financial capital or not. So, really saying, hey, why don't you other minorities be like Asians and Pacific Islanders ignores the very different historical and social context that those other minority groups confront. And then the third kind of reason why the authors are like, we should not look to the Asian community as the primary, you know, the primary driver of this stereotype is that this stereotype ignores the substantial negative impacts that white hostility and discrimination continues to have. Just because you're seen as the model minority, you're still seen as a minority. And we have a variety of empirical evidence that suggests that, like, yes, Asian Americans make more money than other groups. But if you actually look at how much money they maybe should be making, or what type of positions they should be holding given their level of educational attainment, we see a disparity where a person with a similar degree or similar level of job experience, if they are white and not Asian, they are making more money and they have more positions of power. And there are some aspects of society that, despite this so-called model minority success, we really see Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders underrepresented. For instance, like positive imagery, non-stereotypical imagery, and characterization in the media, as well as just in terms of political representation. Asian political representation at the local, state, and national levels doesn't really align with their overall percentage in the country as a whole. And so, it just suggests that it's not a straightforward story. And, your book gives you an example of a respondent, how some Asian respondents really feel about this, that hope that by investing in educational achievement, by pushing their children to achieve educational achievement, that this is going to overcome discrimination. And your book discusses this as a commitment to meritocracy. But if you actually look at the outcomes, there is no guarantee that investing this path is going to result in equitable treatment by larger society. Keyword there is equitable, right? It might result in better treatment than minorities who don't take such a path, but it's still not necessarily going to result in equitable treatment in social institutions by the majority group. The second kind of part of this reading, though, is despite the creation of this stereotype by outsiders, the interviews do make it clear that the families of AAPI individuals have adopted and idealized that stereotype. And the interview snippets kind of emphasize this. But one thing I would like for you to kind of think about is, how does this create issues between parents and their children, when they have these expectations they're expected to uphold, and what types of limits does it put on AAPI young people in terms of their selves and identities, if they feel like they are being perceived through this stereotypical lens by outsiders, but then also pressured by family members to kind of engage in stereotypical activities and pathways. What does this mean for their development of self? To relate this back to the reading by Marcus. The final points from this article is that, this stereotype definitely comes with some personal and psychological costs. And sadly, because this stereotype is so pervasive and is so accepted by both outsiders as well as insiders, this means that when respondents are feeling, anxiety or depression or any type of mental health issue related to the stereotype, they often have no one to turn to. There is an absence of help from school administrators, from public servants, even their own parents. And that psychological impact of feeling like you can only turn to oneself, well, that often makes things like anxiety and depression even worse. And so that quote on page 529, Asian Americans frequently deal with whites' discrimination internally and privately rather than collectively and organizationally. I really want you to consider, what does that mean from like a social movement kind of standpoint? Certainly, we've seen, definitely in African Americans and to a lesser extent, even Latinos and Native Americans, we've seen how collective action and social justice based on collective action can get some needs addressed and voices heard. The fact that Asian American Pacific Islanders are less likely to do this, what does this mean in terms of how their problems are treated and addressed by larger society? And the reading ends with this kind of intersectional discussion of gender and how beauty in America is racialized. I do feel like that's very interesting, but this is an example of what I mean when I say I don't think this is like the best organized reading, because it's not, clearly relevant, and nor do they clearly tie it to the other points from the article. And so, the question I encourage you to consider is, if you're not AAPI, then you may not face the model minority stereotype, but there probably are other so called positive stereotypes associated with your racial ethnic group. How do you respond to such stereotypes? And does it bother you to be stereotyped in such a way, even if it is supposedly positive?